So I'll just say welcome. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. October is Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month. And so in recognition of that, we wanted to use this webinar to recognize the emotional and physical, but also the professional challenges that come up during such a deeply personal experience. I'm hosting the webinar from FSU today. My name is Caitleen Desetti, and I'm an industrial relations organizer with the FSU. And I'm glad to get the opportunity to talk about this topic. I had an early miscarriage a few years ago where I didn't ask for support in work. And I really struggled with this concept of whether I was sort of entitled to grieve such an early loss. And it was a really awful time. And I hope that maybe by shining a light on this topic and talking more openly about how we need to change things, that we can help other women not feel quite so lost and alone when they're going through something similar. I'm joined by Senator Nicole Ryan from Sinn Féin, who is leading the political debate on improving workplace support for employees who are going through a pregnancy loss. Senator Ryan was elected to the Seanad in January 2025. She spent the last decade running her own social enterprise, educating students about the dangers of substance abuse and drug addiction. And today she's here to talk to us about her pregnancy loss bill, which she presented to the Seanad in May. Senator Ryan and I will talk about her bill and the importance of workplace supports, and then we'll open up to audience questions at the end. So do save your questions for then. So with that, Nicole, do you want to start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to draft this bill?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I hope everybody can hear me, and if you can't, just let us know. I am really privileged to be in the Seanad. It's my first time. I ran in the general election in my constituency down in Cork. Didn't get in, but got into the Seanad, so I was delighted. And I guess I kind of hit the ground running initially. I remember we had statements on women's health, and it was like about 2-3 weeks into the Seanad, so you're still learning your feet, etc. And we were talking about, women were standing up and they were talking about different types of services such as cancer, such as PCOS, endometriosis, you name it, all the stuff that we as women go through. And I decided to speak about miscarriage. Last year, just before I ran for the general election, I had my very first miscarriage. I had a miscarriage 2 days shy of 12 weeks. Now, for me, it was my very first pregnancy. I became pregnant on my birthday, my 31st birthday, and everything seemed to be going good until about 7 weeks when I started to bleed. It wasn't heavy bleeding, but it was just bit by bit. And I went to my GP. I was told bleeding is normal. It can happen sometimes. For me, I didn't know what was normal and what wasn't. And I just, trusted in the medical system. I went and got a scan, an early pregnancy scan, and that confirmed that I was doing okay. There's still a heartbeat. So I went back home. I, just carried on. Now the bleeding still continued, but I just put it down as like, it's fine. I'm told that it's nothing's wrong. But 2 days prior to going for my 12-week scan, I woke up covered in blood, and I knew what was happening. So I sat into my car at 5 o'clock in the morning. I drove myself to CUMH. They confirmed that the pregnancy has not progressed. And I went back to the early pregnancy unit the following day. They did the internal scan. They told me that I was miscarrying. And for me, I had never even thought about miscarriage, to be honest. It didn't even enter my head at the time. So I was given my options, which was either D&C, medical management, or just, let it come out naturally. So I chose medical management. And I really wish that I had been kind of briefed a lot better on what that would entail, or how it would impact my body, and how it would feel. I was kind of told it was a bad period, but it was nothing like that. And anyone that has ever gone through that will know that it's different. It affects women very differently from woman to woman. But it was nothing like a bad period. It was horrendous. And even, I suppose, the supports around that, for me, I didn't have much supports by my partner. At the time, he was living over in America, so he was only home for a week. And after that, then I had to be by myself and go through the miscarriage, passing the fetus and not knowing what to do with it, just flushing it down the toilet. And then afterwards, I was expected to just carry on. Like it felt like obviously it was a loss for me, but it felt like I wasn't able to acknowledge that loss, or I wasn't allowed to acknowledge that loss because it was so early. I was, told that, like, I'm sure anyone that has gone through this themselves will know the comments that people tend to give you, which is, sure, aren't you glad you can get pregnant? It'll happen again. Like I was told after I had to do the medical intervention twice. So I was a month long period, and I was told, if you want to try again, like now's the time because you're the most fertile after the first miscarriage in the first 3 months. And for me, that was so far removed from like what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I was feeling was right. I started isolating myself. I didn't want to see people because simple questions like how are you doing or how was your day would trigger me into feeling like I would just break down. And I just didn't want to answer those questions because I felt like I was going crazy. And then I started talking to a couple of women, and they had also told me that they had miscarriages, but they, never said it to anybody. And then I kind of started thinking, like, why is this topic so taboo still in this day and age? If there's a lot of us that have them, why do we not speak of it openly? And equally, for me at the time, I was working, but luckily I was made redundant, I guess, 5 days prior to having a miscarriage. So I didn't have the pressure of going back to work because I had no work to go to. But had I had the pressure of going back to work, I wouldn't have been able to cope. There would be no way that I could go into a workplace, and pretend like nothing was happening to me and that everything was okay because I was just so fragile. So when I got into the Shannon, I started thinking about what workplace I suppose supports there are for women who do suffer miscarriage. And that's when I started to write the pregnancy loss bill. And what that bill looked like, it was quite simply two things. One was acknowledgement. So it was a register which would start to count the amount of pregnancy losses that we do have. Because what we don't count in Ireland at the moment, some clinics do, but it's very ad hoc, is how many women suffer an early pregnancy loss be under 23 weeks. We don't have a full statistic on it. We say 1 in 4, but the reality is that it's a lot more than that, I would suspect, where you have miscarriages, you have people who miscarry at home and then go into the medical system. You have all sorts of types of scenarios. And the acknowledgement bit for me as well, and for a lot of women that I talked to, was really important because under 23 weeks, it's like the state doesn't recognize that your loss is real. After 23 weeks, at 24, 25, you have something tangible, you have a certificate. But under 23 weeks, you don't have anything. You just have, your memories. And, if you're working with groups like Féileacáin, they send you all these lovely, fantastic things, but nothing to acknowledge that your pregnancy existed. So that was the first thing, which was an opt-in register, so people could opt in and get a pregnancy loss certificate. And the second looked at workplace supports. So if you had that pregnancy loss certificate, you could then get it certified by a medical professional, and you'd be entitled to 5 days leave, which wasn't a whole lot, as some of us know. 5 days is nothing when you're going through something like this, but it was a start to build on to more days into the future. So the bill went to debate in July of this year. This year, to the Shannon. The government put in a timed amendment into it, so they delayed it by 12 months. So the bill currently stands, I suppose, in the ether for now. The great thing about initiating something in the Shannon versus initiating it in the Dáil, though, is that once it's initiated in the Shannon, if there's a timed amendment put on it, you can bring it back and it moves to the next stage. So currently the bill sits at second stage, but when I bring it back next year, it'll move to committee stage, third stage. So that's where amendments can be made and, the government can put in other things. It was quite disappointing because I just think that we weren't asking for a lot, and going through a bill, it takes a long time before it's enacted and put into law. Like it can take years. Sometimes it could take the whole term. But I suppose off the back of that, what we then did was we said, okay, we started a cross-party Oireachtas group on pregnancy and infant loss. So we said, right, the bill is one thing and it can't do anything right now, but there's a lot of things that we can do without legislation. So one of the things that we're lobbying at the moment is to look at still the pregnancy loss certificate, but look at it as the voluntary register without any paid attachment. So just the acknowledgement bit. Now, Scotland has done this quite successfully, where they have a register and you can opt in, but there's no paid leave per se, but you still get a certificate. And then the second thing, I suppose, is the workplace supports. Now, the Pregnancy Loss Research Group have just 2 weeks ago, I think, launched their workplace supports of what workplaces can do to support women in the workplace. Because if you think about women, like we can bear children, men can't bear children, biologically. So we're at a disadvantage here because we're getting discriminated against for being able to bring children into the world. And the fact that we have to use sick leave, we have to use annual leave or compassionate leave for things like this, it's not right because we're not sick. We have had a loss. So it's looking at how do we support people. And sometimes it's really hard for employers because sometimes they don't know what to say. Because a lot of time people don't know what to say when you've had a loss. And it can be as simple as, I don't want you to say anything. I just want you to maybe listen. Or I, just need this support, or I need this kind of flexi time, or just it's an understanding. So there are stuff that we can do while the bill's still stalled for the time being. There is another bill, which is the Labour bill, which is now in committee stage at the Dáil, but it hasn't been brought to the Dáil floor. That looks at also workplace protections around IVF, miscarriage, and pregnancy loss. But we just don't really know where it is at the moment. I've tried to ask Labour a few times, but I haven't really had much of an update. But hopefully, maybe that can progress a lot faster. The My Bill can, but at the moment, I'll still continue pushing the bill. And I suppose having the conversations, because ever since I stood up in the chamber that day, I've had so many women that I've connected with around this, and the stories that they tell, the stories are so unique, yet I suppose the treatment is very common. You hear about how they weren't supported or how they were dismissed or how all of these kind of things that are, as women, we know in the medical system don't always work in our favor. And it's kind of, I suppose, letting people know that like it's okay to talk about it. Like it is a loss and your loss is valid, whether it was 2 weeks, whether it was 7 weeks, or whether it was, 23 weeks, it still existed and it should be acknowledged and supported either way.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Nicole. It's clear how much work you've put into this issue. I do think for people who haven't gone through a pregnancy loss, there's sometimes an unawareness of what actually happens to a person. And so the fact that you're willing to talk so openly about something that is so personal and private and sad is incredible, because I think first of all it shows how serious you are about this issue, but also it helps toward trying to change that reality for other women, and like you said, trying to lift the taboo a little bit. I want to talk a bit about the employment protection side of it, because most women of reproductive age are in paid employment. So what someone goes through at work during a pregnancy loss really has a huge impact on them, both in work and at home. And you mentioned it, and just to say, like, there's a big distinction in law between a pregnancy loss before 23 weeks and one that's after 23 weeks. After 23 weeks, you're legally entitled to your full maternity leave or paternity leave if you're a partner. And before 23 weeks, nothing. So you either are facing an immediate return to work, or if you need time off, you're looking at trying to take other leave entitlements like sick leave, like annual leave, or compassionate leave. And whether your employer has more supportive policies in place is going to make a huge difference for a couple during, an overwhelmingly sad time. So it's something in FSU that we've had some success negotiating into workplace policies in places where we do have collective bargaining. So in Bank of Ireland, in AIB, in Ulster Bank, and in Danske Bank, we have dedicated policies for early pregnancy loss. So that's, again, the before 23 weeks piece. And that gives women and their partners access to among those different employments, somewhere between 10 and 15 days of paid leave, plus entitlement to other supports like flexible working hours, like more days working from home, where roles allow for that. And it's really important not only to have just the leave, but a more comprehensive look at flexible supports as well. And I say dedicated policy because, especially from the union perspective, it's really essential that early pregnancy loss is specifically called out, even if it's falling under compassionate leave. To be specifically called out in that policy is really important. And it's not good enough for employers to put their hands up and just say, well, someone can apply under compassionate leave or bereavement leave if they want to. No, it needs to be called out so that women and also their partners know their entitlement, and they don't have to feel like they're going begging for extra leave during one of the most difficult times of their lives. So to have that really clearly spelled out is really important. And Nicole, I guess just in terms of, you've talked a bit about what your bill aims to do. What do you see as, in the employment space, best practice for employers to be doing? And is there kind of one or two simple things that an employer could do today or tomorrow that would help toward this?
Oh, absolutely. I think I suppose the best practices for everybody in the company, from CEO to the person that comes in, to first of all understand what pregnancy loss is, because like you said, not everybody understands what it is or why it's important. Sometimes I've had people, say to me like, oh, what's the point of the register? Like, is because like what are they going to get out of it? And people tie register with the paid leave, as in like that's the connection, but like the register is the acknowledgement piece. So educating employers around what that could mean for you, or just understanding to become empathetic around loss, because even though it might seem like, oh, it was only 5 weeks, like how could you didn't even know, this person, this life in you, how could you possibly be attached to it? That's not for you to say. And you need to understand it from a compassionate view. And then, like you said, it's simply calling it out and separating it from compassionate leave, from bereavement leave. It's not the same thing. It needs its own policy and it needs its own suite of supports, because I'm not sick. I'm not sick. I'm grieving a loss. It's not the same as like a bereavement per se, because again, it's like it's still early on. It's hard to define it that kind of way, but it does need to be on its own, because even like going back to work, for instance, if I was a teacher and I was in a school and I was teaching really young children, like to me, that's going to be a trigger when I come back into that school and see all these little cute faces in front of me, and I'm triggered instantly thinking about, God, that could be my child. And like, how do you explain that to somebody who doesn't know that you're going through it? But equally, confidentiality is really important in this, because I don't want my employer to be telling everybody that I've just gone through it unless I'm comfortable with saying it to other people myself. It should never be a thing like, I go in and then everybody in the factory knows that I've had a miscarriage. Like, it has to be confidential, because not everybody wants people to know. And sometimes not everybody acknowledges the loss as a loss. There are women that, just don't, and that's totally okay. But just having the support there is really important, that they can say, okay, if I want to avail of it, I will use it.
Yeah, yeah. If so, is there something that the people who've kind of tuned into the webinar today, and anyone who's listening back to the podcast version of this later, is there anything that they can do to help you get that bill passed?
I guess what, the easiest thing that you can do is annoy the hell out of your local TDs and your local senators, and write to them to highlight that this is an issue. This is an issue in your constituency that's affecting people in your area, and you need to like pay attention to it. And this needs to be brought onto the political stage. It needs to be an agenda. Like, it needs to be a political priority, because for so long it hasn't been. The reality is women's health hasn't been a priority, not a mind miscarriage or loss or anything like that. So I'd say if everyone just like wrote to their TD and wrote to their local representative and said, look, these are the issues, women are facing this, we need help, and just annoy them. I think that's a good way to do it, because for now the bill is going to stay where it is until it starts to move again. And then there'll be a whole other suite of lobbying then to do again. But, it's bringing it to people's attention, I think, is really important, because unless you've been through it, you don't really think about it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's so true that like women's health for so long just has not been a priority and it's not on the agenda. And I wonder, like, do you think that support in work during a pregnancy loss is more of an issue now than in the past? Or, like more women are in the workforce, perhaps? Or do you think it's just that case of like not having brought it up and not having been confident to speak openly? What is it that's making people speak out about it now in a way they haven't before?
I suppose it's twofold. It's been always been happening. It's just women have never really talked about it so openly. When you think about it, especially in Ireland, like Catholic shame, growing up and all of that's component. We're barely talking about sex right now, not mind something like a pregnancy loss. That's hidden, there's just something that you just get over with or you get on with and you try again. And that was just the way, your grandmother would have thought and the generations before her. The other thing, I guess, is around workplace protection for a woman. So I suppose in the bill, what I didn't mention was that there was employment protection for the woman. So she couldn't get fired or dismissed or any of that. So like if I'm a young woman, in my 20s and I'm starting off my career, and my employer, there's like this kind of fear, I suppose, as a woman, if my employer finds out that I'm trying for a baby, they're going to think she's going to be out for maternity leave, she's not going to come back to work, this, that, the other, all of these knock-on effects. I'm not going to hire her because she's not going to progress. I'm not, there is that I suppose it's not
Mm.
openly said, and like employers can't say it because they'll be brought to court. But there is that thing where you're like, God, if they know that I'm trying to get pregnant, will I lose my job? And there's a fear around that. So it's both, we're talking about it more, it's always happened, we're just starting to make a bit more noise about it, but equally it's the fear of losing your job.
Yeah, yeah. I want to open up to audience questions, but just before we do, because when we turn over to audience questions, we're going to turn off the recording so that people feel comfortable if there's anything private they want to talk about. So before we turn over to that, is there any last words that you want to say about the bill or anything that's in there that you haven't mentioned yet?
Not per se about the bill, but I think there are great people in the space that are doing great work in hospitals, and I don't want to diminish that. Every experience is very different, but there are people that are lobbying for this. There are women, there are doctors, there are midwives, nurses that are doing fantastic work. What we need is just uniformity across all 19 maternity hospitals. Um, and I suppose that comes down to funding, and I suppose that's my job, is to lobby for that funding so that everyone has equal access across Ireland, not just if you're in Cork, you're getting better service than up in, I don't know, Mayo. But there are good services out there, so don't be afraid to use them.
Yeah.
That's what I would
Is
say.
there, do you want to mention any, if someone is listening to this who is going through a loss and wants to avail of service, who could they reach out to?
You can reach out to, first of all, you have the Pregnancy Loss Research Group. They're based in UCC, but they would have a lot of contacts across Ireland. You have Féileacáin as well. They're really fantastic around bereavement. And we have the Miscarriage Association as well as the Stillbirth and Neonatal Care. They're also fantastic too. So, if you're really at a loss or you don't know, I would suggest any of those groups would be really great as a starting point if you're looking for that help and that support.
Okay.